Yeah, so the official title of one of the two papers that we are publishing right now is called Thousand Brain Systems, Sensorimotor Intelligence for Rapid, Robust Learning and Inference. But as Vivian said, we often have referred to it as the Demonstrating Monty's Capabilities paper, or DMC for short. And this paper is really kind of a culmination of a huge amount of work. I'd argue around 3 years. Going back even further, though, to when Jeff and together with researchers at Numenta kind of laid out the principles of Thousand Brains theory. Those were what Jeff wrote about in his book, A Thousand Brains. These ideas were then taken to both at Numenta originally and then at the Thousand Brains project to try and develop a system that actually implemented these concepts. And that is what became TPP.Monty. So the first kind of code implementation of a Thousand Brains system. That is a system that implements the kind of concepts and the algorithms described in the Thousand Brains theory. But we had that kind of system there, and we had benchmarks that we ran internally to look at it. But what we really wanted to do was to kind of compile an overview of all the things it was capable of into one kind of paper, at least all the things it's capable of today. Of course, we're constantly working on new features and the like. And so that's what kind of became the DMC paper. And it's been a huge effort from really everyone on the team, but particular shout out to Scott and Hojay for all this work that they put into this. And the kind of main things that we really wanted to emphasize in this paper was the capabilities of robust inference, rapid inference, and rapid continual efficient learning. Which is a bit of a mouthful, but we'll break this all down shortly. It's also maybe worth emphasizing that kind of what I'm presenting today is going to be focused on the results in the paper, and in particular, kind of trying to give an intuition around the experiments we ran, what sort of metrics we used, what the results were, and any kind of implications of those. But I'm going to assume you have kind of a working understanding. If you're watching this, I'm going to assume you have a working understanding of Monty. And if you're kind of new to Monty and new to the Thousand Brains project, these are the kind of resources I would recommend starting with to get that kind of background knowledge first. So things like the December symposium we did last year, documentation on our readme.io, and the methods section in this paper for kind of a especially detailed description. But very briefly, just as a kind of broad reminder, so Monty is an architecture defined by a series of semi-independent learning modules that work together and receive information from sensor modules and output goals via a motor system. These semi-independent units communicate via a kind of common communication protocol we call the cortical messaging protocol. And this is defined by features that have a pose in space in kind of a shared coordinate system, as well as other features like things like color, object ID, and so forth. And so this gives kind of an overview of what Monty's system looks like when it's perceiving something like a cup here. And the input Monty gets is from a very small region of space. So you can think of kind of the receptive field of any given learning module being defined by the sensor module that it's getting input from. And typically this will be a small patch relative to the size of a total object. Sensor module's responsibility is outputting pose and features. And so that's the CMP signal that gets sent to learning modules. And then the learning module is where the kind of pose and features are received. These are then learned in reference frames. So we'll talk briefly about learning later, but as the system moves, it kind of builds up a representation of where these poses and features are sensed. And then these same reference frames can be used during inference to develop hypotheses about on which object and where on which object the system might be. But it can also then kind of gather this information to have a hypothesis about what the most likely ID it is of the kind of object it's perceiving is, as well as generate kind of goal states that enable it to act intelligently in the world. So basically, how does it want the kind of state of the motor system to be in order to achieve a certain goal? And this is just showing that this kind of up here is just showing that the learning module changes over time as it receives new sensory input and outputs goal states. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour. As said, please check out those other resources if all of that was kind of unfamiliar. But this paper was really about kind of starting with these principles, sensory motor modules with reference frames that perform learning, and examining kind of what is the broad range of capabilities that this gives you. And before I kind of talk about our first results with inference, it's worth kind of just emphasizing that Monty as a sensory motor system is all about moving, and whether it's learning or performing inference, it's constantly on the move. And this is what this kind of animation is showing you here, just an example of Monty as kind of a finger-like system. You're seeing kind of a trace of its movement going along the handle of something and then jumping over here. And so during learning, this might consist of kind of a policy that's particularly good at densely sampling an object. So if it's familiar, and so with this kind of camera-like agent we have, for example, we would look at an object like this mug, doing a scan, and then Monty would develop part of a model of this object, and then it might observe it again, for example, if the object rotated from a different angle, and then use its observations from that second encounter to update its memory. And during inference, it also moves, but in general, it might move in a more unstructured way. Certainly it does in the case of this paper, because here the goal is different from learning. Here the goal is about kind of rapidly recognizing what objects it's seeing rather than developing a new representation. And so you see, for example, this kind of path as the system moves over the surface of the object before jumping over to the handle of the mug, as well as then the kind of rim. And kind of one of the first figures showing actual results in the paper is just trying to give you an intuition of what kind of inference in Monty actually looks like. And so that's what this is showing here, where we have the kind of internal model that Monty has of a mug, as well as a representation of kind of where in space its sensor module actually is at that point in time. So what it's seeing is, as you can see, it's a extremely ambiguous sensation at that given point. That's kind of equivalent to if you were touching this mug with your finger, or if you were looking at it through a straw. And then on the right is the kind of evidence values associated with different objects that Monty knows about. And so what you see kind of at the top is that the first step, it initializes some hypotheses about what object it might be on based on what it's just seen. And so given this kind of red color and the curvature of the surface, this seems to match reasonably quite well with the side of a mug, to a certain degree with the side of a bowl, and not particularly well with the side of a white golf ball. Then over kind of a series of movements, Monty integrates that kind of movement that's taken place to update these hypotheses, and then receives new information. And over kind of a course of an episode, it then narrows down its hypotheses about where it might be. And so you can see how it kind of gradually eliminates the bowl and quickly eliminates the golf ball as possible locations. And then in the case of the mug, it kind of narrows down in space where it might be based on what it's observing. And the kind of data set we used for all of our experiments was the 77 objects in the YCB dataset. So this is a collection of household objects, such as like a fork, banana, screwdriver, and so forth, that have been 3D scanned and made available. And during learning, Monty is presented in general, unless kind of noted otherwise, these objects at sort of 14 canonical rotations. And what we mean by that is kind of the 6 rotations corresponding to the faces of a cube, as well as the 8 rotations corresponding to the corners of a cube, for a total of 14. And you can see we have this kind of distant agent that does that more kind of scan-like policy, the representation it develops across these views, and then the surface agent, which kind of moves more freely across the surface of the object, develops kind of representations all over the object when given a single view. But because it kind of does these narrow paths, it also benefits from kind of multiple exposures to develop a good model. So that's the kind of preamble. I should also maybe say that, yeah, well, it maybe makes sense to leave kind of any discussion to the end. Obviously, if anyone on the kind of research team or otherwise kind of notices I left something out, feel free to jump in and mention it. So the kind of first main result in the paper is looking at inference, and in particular, the robustness of this. And so those same 77 objects that Monty has learned on are now used to evaluate the performance of the model. And we were looking at classification accuracy, so does it correctly recognize what object it's seen, and also rotation error, which we measure in degrees. So how well is the predicted rotation? How well does that align to the actual rotation of the object in the environment when Monty sees it? And this very first kind of base condition in this figure, although it's the simplest, it's worth kind of pointing out that although the object is presented at one of those 14 rotations that Monty has seen before, because of the way kind of random seeds and policies work and so forth, the sensory path that Monty will follow on that object is actually different. And so it still needs to kind of generalize, at least to a certain degree, in the sense that it's not getting the exact same observations it's seen before as it moves over the object. And as you can see, the accuracy is extremely high, close to 100%, and the rotation error, the distribution shown in this violin plot is very low. But we obviously wanted to make things more interesting. So that's where we then started introducing noise. And we added this noise to kind of a variety of features of the model, or rather the kind of perception that Monty is getting informed the CNP signal. That was things like the location of that signal, as well as the color associated with the color feature. And you can see how this certainly starts to obscure some of the finer grained details of the models, things like the rim, as well as the general shape of the handle. But fortunately, Monty still shows it's robust to this in terms of the accuracy and rotation error. It's not much change.
The noise is not just applied to color and location, which is visualized here, but also to the point normals and curvature directions and to the amount of curvature that is being sensed.
Right.
And yeah,
right.
basically all the features that come into the learning module.
Yeah, that are important. No, good point. But to kind of, really test Monty's limit, we then introduced new rotations. So these are rotations that Monty has not seen at all at any point in training data for any object, as well as combining those new rotations with sensor noise, and then finally adding in a new color where we basically set all the objects, all the observations that Monty gets for any object to this kind of intense blue color. So it loses any kind of visual texture information it might otherwise get from the object surface. You can see that there is a kind of some drop in performance, but it's worth emphasizing that this is a data set with 77 objects, 5 novel rotations. Chance performance is very low, in the order of kind of 1%. And Monty in general is kind of doing quite well on this, given that even for a human, you can imagine that if you start kind of obscuring information like color, as well as adding noise to the kind of locations of where things are being sensed, that becomes very difficult. Things like the fork and the spoon, the prongs of the fork become this kind of cloud of points, things like that. And there's also certain objects in the data set, like these series of cups, which are pretty much only distinguished by their color. So the fact that Monty gets such a high accuracy and reasonable rotation error is actually quite encouraging. I think this is doubly so because all of this noise that we're adding at inference time is out of distribution, which is to say Monty is never trained on any of these perturbations in order to increase its robustness to these. And this is in general a very challenging thing to achieve. Kind of robustness often relies on a degree of interpolations. As long as you densely sample the space and then kind of test something in between those points, then you can kind of generalize. But here we're really seeing generalization that goes out of the distribution that Monty has seen before. So this is kind of the first result we were really excited to share. And we'll talk a bit more about kind of how this relates, how is Monty actually achieving this and how this relates to this concept of kind of shape bias and kind of using shape to recognize objects. In order to kind of understand that a bit better, we then wanted to look at the kind of internal representations that Monty develops and how these kind of relate to different objects and the shapes of those objects. So in order to do this, one thing we can do is look at the evidence values associated with objects. So what I mean by that is in Monty, when it's sensing an object, it has a series of hypotheses kind of inside each learning module that increment over time based on movement and the next sensory observation. And that's what we're kind of plotting here is for a particular learning module, it has these different hypotheses, and you can see how they're increasing over time. And for the point of view of this diagram, this kind of gold point is the point at which the spoon head is sensed. And so the learning module kind of becomes quite confident that it's seeing the spoon as opposed to something else. But you can see up until that point, the amount of evidence it has for these objects is quite similar. And these objects all have, as we'll kind of get to in a moment, an elongated kind of narrow portion of their shape. And so what I'll show on the next slide is we can look at these evidence values across a series of experiments, and in particular kind of see if Monty is recognizing and actually sensing one object like the spoon, what other objects does it have kind of similarly high evidence values for versus what objects does it have very low evidence values for. And that's what is shown in this figure of the paper, where we cluster the different objects, these 10 different objects, based on the evidence values that Monty has when it's recognizing a particular object. And what this shows is that Monty quite naturally clusters these objects based on sort of shape or morphology that humans would also kind of naturally kind of identify in these. So you have these kind of cutlery objects that are elongated with this end to them. You have these box-like objects, and then you have these cup-like objects. And it's important to kind of emphasize that Monty doesn't have a kind of objective function with some supervised label that encourages this kind of clustering. This just naturally emerges in the kind of representations it develops from how it kind of, the hypotheses that it has when it's recognizing a particular object. It also just kind of shows some of the things like the D cup here is a largely, or is a yellow object, as is for the most part the sugar box. You can see they are kind of very far apart in this kind of clustering space, whereas the kind of mug-like objects are much closer. And then this mug, which has this kind of distinct handle, that seems to kind of lead to a more significant separation from these other cups. So there's kind of a lot of almost semantic kind of consistency, it seems, in this clustering. Then the kind of significance of all this is that, this emphasizes that Monty kind of uses or kind of is sensitive to the shape of objects. And this is almost certainly the kind of source of its robustness to noise that we saw earlier, including that situation where it had an entirely new color. Because if Monty is using kind of global structure, then even if we perturb locations a bit, even if we add an entirely different color, even if we rotate the object entirely, none of those perturbations are changing the global kind of structure of the object, its shape. Obviously, if we added a huge amount of noise to those locations and it just became kind of a random point cloud, then Monty's performance would dramatically fall in the same way that to a human, it would no longer look like the kind of original object it was. And this is kind of something that's worth dwelling on because kind of recognizing objects by their shape and kind of using that as the primary basis of recognition is something that humans do naturally, but it has not been a property that has kind of emerged naturally in deep learning systems, in the sense that already back in 2019, it was noted that if you kind of took a image like this cat and kind of replaced the texture of the image with something else like this elephant skin, but preserved the kind of global shape, deep learning systems would confidently classify it based on the texture, not on the shape. And this became referred to as this kind of texture versus shape bias. Fast forward to today, and despite training on virtually the entire internet's worth of kind of images, huge amount more data than humans are kind of exposed to in the same way, these systems still show this kind of texture shape bias. Obviously, Monty is kind of looking at objects in 3D here, but kind of prior work with kind of reference frames and 2D grid cells showed a similar effect where when you use reference frames with a sensory motor system that moves through that reference frame, and kind of binds observations to locations, you get this much stronger kind of reliance on shape and the kind of global the global arrangement of features, rather than this kind of sensitivity to high frequency textures that seem to correlate with object classes and therefore seem to be picked up by deep learning systems. I should maybe, clarify that. So this figure here, what this is showing is kind of the degree of texture bias. So over here is classifying entirely based on texture, and over here is based on shape. And you can see humans are essentially entirely based on shape. And this is just showing where different deep learning systems fall on that spectrum. And this is, an exciting result, even if we haven't kind of gone all the way down of applying different textures to the objects like was done in this prior study. This is still an exciting result because of what it implies and what we can look at in the future, because adversarial examples are these kind of bizarre instances where you can add a imperceptible amount of noise, targeted noise to an image such as this, and a deep learning system will confidently classify it as something else. And just like that texture bias, this is something that scaling deep learning systems, giving them more and more data, has not solved. And it's almost certainly related, there's already good evidence, but it's almost certainly related to shape bias, because of course, by adding this kind of targeted noise, you are perturbing the pixels in a very high frequency way, but the global shape to a human has remained entirely unaltered. It's not something we looked at in this paper, but you could imagine there are ways you could create an adversarial example for Monty, but what that adversarial example would consist of would be rearranging the locations of the features to convince it that it's seeing a different object. And the end effect would be changing the actual identity of the object to something else. So essentially something that would also fool a human, and therefore kind of a totally different type of phenomenon from these adversarial examples. So far, we've kind of been looking at robustness in this sort of umbrella of noise, but that's not the kind of only, in various kind of types of noise and perturbation. But kind of robustness goes beyond that. And in particular, it's really important for a good representation to have these properties of what are known as equivariance and invariance. And basically, equivariant means that it changes, a representation changes as the state of the world changes. Invariant means it doesn't change. And for an intelligent system to be useful, it should have a mixture of equivariant and invariant representations under different conditions. And I'll try and make that a bit more concrete. So you can imagine if you were looking at these pencils, although the one on the right has a different color and a slightly different shape, it's shorter and so forth, and a bit wider, you still recognize these as pencils. And so your representation of a pencil is invariant to these changes in detail, such as color or certain changes in shape. And you would also be robust to, for example, seeing this pencil in a dark room. But if you kind of turn the pencil like this, these two different kind of ways of holding it in a hand, your representation of where the pencil is in space and how it's oriented changes. So that means that representation is equivariant. On the other hand, if you rotate it on the kind of long axis of the pencil, then as far as you're concerned, it's basically in the same orientation. And so those rotations are symmetric. So for certain rotations, you want the system to be invariant to recognize symmetry, but for others, you want it to be equivariant. It sounds simple because it's something that humans do kind of naturally all the time, but it's actually a really difficult property to bake into a learning system. And kind of another really exciting result with Monty was that we found that these kind of symmetry representations emerge essentially naturally. And in particular, you can imagine having an object like this cup made up of points, and it can have a variety of rotations which are inherently ambiguous. So these different kind of ones here are showing the same model, but rotated by these different amounts represented here. And as far as a human is concerned, these look like they're the same rotation, but a rotation like this looks different. What's interesting about Monty is as it's kind of recognizing an object and sensing it, it has these hypotheses about the potential rotation of the object. And those are informed by what it's sensing. So it's this is kind of a detail that's maybe best understood if you look at the paper, but it's not like Monty has a list of rotations that has experienced before, and it's only going to look at that list of rotations. It's kind of, it senses the object. Based on that, it can kind of have a hypothesis about where it will be oriented. But as it's kind of moving across this cup, it's going to have a series of hypotheses that are all valid, that are all getting sensory observations that are consistent with the model with that rotation. On the other hand, the hypothesis associated with this rotation of the object would not be getting consistent evidence. And so the evidence value associated with this would quickly decay and kind of decrease. What happens in Monty then is if it has a series of these kinds of hypotheses that are persistent together for a long time. So for one object, a set of rotations that are all kind of persistently active, it then eventually reaches a kind of threshold, a state at which it says, okay, I believe these objects to be symmetric. And so this was what we kind of called sensorimotor symmetric, because the way that symmetry is kind of determined is through sensorimotor exploration of the object. And Monty can kind of continue sensorimotor exploration as long as it would like, in order to kind of verify with greater and greater certainty the existence of symmetry. In order to kind of then examine this a bit further in the paper, we wanted to use an additional metric. So I mentioned earlier that we use rotation error generally when reporting how good Monty is at predicting the rotation of the object. That's because it's a very intuitive metric. But a kind of common metric in the literature for measuring more symmetry type properties is something known as the chamfer distance, which you can basically think of as a kind of metric for the distance between two sets of points. So if you had a point cloud like this blue one and this orange one, you would basically, for each point in the orange one, find its nearest neighbor in the blue set of points, calculate that distance, and then do the same thing for all the other points, sum those up, and then do the same thing for the blue one comparing to the orange. And what you'd end up with is a metric that's high for two kind of sets of points like these, and low for two sets of points like these. What the kind of advantage of using this metric is that if an object's model is kind of symmetric, and then you kind of apply different rotations, as long as that symmetry is kind of true, then you would get a low chamfer distance. And so that's what this figure in the paper was looking at. So what you're seeing here is a single example of this particular object, this green cup. Excuse me, this is its ground truth rotation. And then there are a series of rotations we kind of report here. On the left is the rotation error in degrees, which again is what we generally report throughout the paper. And then on the right is the chamfer distance I was just describing. The kind of different types of rotations we have here are what's called min. So this is, of all the rotations that Monty has a hypothesis about, this is the one with the smallest rotation error to the ground truth one. The most likely hypothesis, this is just the rotation that happens to have the most evidence at that given point in time. Although in general, what we would find if you were to look at the evidence values for these different rotations, they would all be extremely similar. And then a symmetric rotation here is just an example of another rotation in the set of symmetric rotations according to Monty. It's just one of these other rotations that is deemed symmetric. That doesn't happen to be the minimum one relative to ground truth, and it doesn't happen to be the most likely hypothesis. And then lastly, this is just a random rotation, which Monty does not believe to be symmetric. And what this shows is that we get a very low chamfer distance associated with all three of these rotations when we apply these to the kind of learned model, consistent with those having some true symmetry and kind of consistent with human perception. Whereas the random rotation, the kind of purple bar here, the chamfer distance, does not. On the other hand, this figure also shows that the rotation error can vary wildly depending on which kind of particular rotation is reported. And so this is why in the paper, we actually report the minimum rotation of this set in order to essentially kind of capture the true error associated while avoiding the kind of lack of intuition that the chamfer distance gives. But as kind of a an additional sanity check. So this is from one example. We kind of ran the same metric over many different objects that Monty sees. And again, looked at the rotation error and the chamfer distance associated with these kinds of different hypotheses that Monty developed, and in particular, the ones that it believed were symmetric. And what you see here is, again, across all of these different examples, the chamfer distance associated with kind of any rotation that Monty deems symmetric is very similar to the kind of one with the minimal rotation error versus the ground truth, which kind of supports the metric we ultimately used. So that was kind of getting into a lot of details about how we kind of measure symmetry and that sort of thing. But I think it's worth taking a step back and just kind of emphasizing how exciting it is that Monty develops this. And again, kind of this wasn't something where we have a specific objective function where Monty needs to report symmetry, or where it has access to ground truth models in order to measure its ability to detect symmetry. This was just something that emerged naturally through having a sensorimotor system kind of move over an object, try and recognize its rotation and the hypotheses that it was developing. And this is, a really great attribute to have in the system in terms of kind of long-term future capabilities. So you can imagine, going back to that pencil example, that depending on its orientation, if you're learning to do something like writing or erasing, that will depend a lot on the orientation of the pencil along certain axes, along certain kind of rotations of symmetry. On the other hand, if you kind of, again, spin the pencil in your hand, that has no effect on the ability of this pencil tip to write. And so it's really important that every time you spin the pencil, your system doesn't say, oh, this is a new rotation, I have to now relearn how to use this particular object. In this particular case, it's about kind of behavior and how you interact with an object, but this also applies to kind of compositional representations where one object is part of another object and so forth. So we were really happy to see this kind of symmetry emerge the way it did. So that was a lot about robust inference. Next, I'm going to be talking about kind of rapid inference and how quickly kind of Monty can recognize what it's seen in the world. And it's worth kind of starting by just emphasizing, biological perception is inherently about movement. And so when we kind of look around the world, only a tiny fraction at the center of our visual field is actually in high acuity. If that part of our eye, the kind of fovea, if it had the same visual acuity just a few degrees out, we would be kind of legally blind in terms of the amount of sensory impairment that would give us. So we're hugely dependent on being able to rapidly move our eyes, but of course this applies to other modalities like our hands and so forth. This is, naturally baked into Monty, but up until now, we've not talked a lot about how Monty is actually moving. And so one of the other kind of exciting things that we're showing in this paper is how it can use policies to act intelligently, and a mixture of what are known as kind of model-free and model-based policies. So model-free policies are where you are just taking the kind of sensory information coming in, and without an explicit model deciding how to act in the world. And so in the paper, we look at this kind of surface curvature guided exploration policy where Monty kind of follows along the kind of surface of an object, maintaining contact with it based on what it's sensing. And also when it identifies areas of prominent curvature, like the rim of this glass or the kind of bottom of this cup, it sometimes then follows that for kind of a period of time. This was our kind of model-free one. And so this is the kind of thing that older parts of the brain can be kind of responsible for in humans, but can still be, quite powerful. But the other kind of policy we look at is this model-based one that we call the hypothesis testing policy. The reason it has this name is because Monty essentially has a series of hypotheses, and it's going to act in a way to test those hypotheses and eliminate one of them. And so what this figure in the paper was showing is this is the actual object that Monty is sensing as it is in the world. So in this case, this spoon, it starts on this part of the handle, moves along the bottom of the handle, and then at that point, Monty, or rather one of the learning modules in Monty, outputs a goal state to move to the head of the spoon in order to disambiguate it from another object. How does it decide to move to the head of the spoon? This is where it's making use of its internal models, hence the term model-based policy. And in particular, Monty has, at this point, a strong hypothesis for the spoon in this particular orientation and the fork in this particular orientation. And it can mentally compare these two hypotheses, and through that, determine that the kind of largest distance between these models, the kind of biggest anomaly between their structure, is here at the kind of head of the object, at the kind of tip of the spoon. And so that would be the best place to move. You can imagine if it moved to, say, this location, the neck, which it hasn't explored yet, it's going to observe the same thing, whether it's on the fork or the spoon. And so that's a less useful observation to get next. And so I've kind of shifted the figure over, and then this is showing the next part of that figure where we plotted the evidence values that Monty had internally as a function of the kind of step in the episode and when it takes this kind of goal-driven step. So you can see that the hypotheses for most of these objects are that have kind of a similar shape, a similar morphology, like the spoon, the fork, the knife, and a marker. You get a reasonable amount of increase as time is going by. But at this point at which Monty kind of executes this goal state, it suddenly gets this kind of divergence in the hypotheses, because now all of the observations after this point are corresponding to this head of the spoon and are not consistent, basically, with a fork or a knife. What this then kind of next figure in the paper was showing is that the same thing can also be done for poses. So you can imagine, rather than disambiguating two different objects, if Monty is pretty confident it's on the mug, but it's not actually sure where the mug is or kind of how the mug is oriented in space, it can use the same principles to kind of infer this. And so in this case, the two hypothesized rotations that are kind of deemed most likely result in different orientations of the handle. And so based on one of these hypotheses, Monty is going to attempt to move to that handle. And you see again that once it goes to that location and executes this goal state, all of the hypotheses associated with kind of incompatible observations suddenly start kind of losing evidence. And so we then kind of looked at what effect this has on inference as a whole, and in particular, if we kind of look at accuracy as well as number of steps in a total episode, we can see that with kind of baseline policy where we're performing more like a random walk without kind of any kind of consistent direction or being informed by curvature. This is the kind of model-free policy here. And also without the kind of model-based goal states, we get a reasonable accuracy, but we get a lot of instances of timed out episodes. So these are instances where Monty still had the correct hypothesis at the end of the episode. So if it was sensing the mug, it believes the most likely object is the mug, but it's in a low confidence state about that, likely because it hasn't seen a feature that would kind of, without a doubt, disambiguate it from other objects. And we set a max of 500 steps for each episode. And so these kind of times out episodes are what correspond to these kinds of episodes up here that essentially continue until the end. On the other hand, if Monty becomes very confident about what it's observing, it can then kind of terminate the episode and declare, this is the object I believe it is. And that's what we see here is a significant increase in these kind of converged episodes when we introduce the model-free and then the model-based policies. And that's kind of reflected over here in terms of the kind of number of steps associated with the episode. It's interesting that we already get such strong performance with the model-free policy that the model-based policy only gives kind of some incremental improvements in accuracy. It's not a huge change at that point, but we're still really excited about kind of implications of this policy because of what it means in terms of acting intelligently in the world. So it seems to be the case that for the benchmarks we have at the moment, being able to kind of efficiently do something like move to the head of the spoon doesn't result in kind of dramatic change in improvement, but as you kind of introduce more noise or need to act more quickly to carry out certain goals, then this kind of distinguishing kind of benefit is likely to become more apparent. And one of the kind of other elements about the sort of model-based policy that we're quite happy with was all of this learning of the model is taking place independently of kind of explicit rewards. That is to say, Monty is just exploring these objects and learning about it in the same way that if you were kind of in a new city, or if you were kind of given a new object to hold, you would very quickly kind of learn its properties without necessarily being told by someone that you're going to be paid or have some sort of task to complete that requires you solving that. It's just this kind of natural ability to kind of quickly learn about the world. And this fits really well with what was observed by Tolman all the way back in 1948 when he studied learning in rats, where if you put them in a maze, they will just naturally learn a lot of the structure of this maze, even when they don't have a reward such as food. And so this kind of is key really to if you're going to be able to develop representations that can enable flexible behavior, because the reality is reward signals in the world are sparse and rarely received. What you really want is a system that naturally goes out there and just learns about what there is. So that was all the stuff about rapid inference and policies. The next bit I'll be talking about rapid inference and voting. Voting is this particular algorithm that Numenta had originally proposed in the context of cortical columns, and has then been adapted in Monty and also kind of evolved to enable it to work well. And to kind of motivate it or just kind of put it into context. So we've been talking a lot about the importance of movement and how biological perception is inherently sensorimotor. It's all about movement, really. But with that said, of course, we are also able to integrate inputs from multiple sensory organs, either from different parts of, for example, our retina, or from, for example, our hand, our eyes. It's not the case, that we actually perceive the world in a kind of total straw world way like this. And so the question is, okay, how do you integrate this information in a way that still gives robustness and enables kind of more rapid inference? The voting algorithm's fairly involved, and so I won't kind of go into the full details here. There's hopefully a helpful description in the method section of the paper that goes into the details. But at a high level, you have different learning modules that are receiving inputs from different sensory modules. So, for example, a left hand and a right hand here. And each of these learning modules has some hypotheses about what objects it's seeing. And with voting, they're basically able to share those hypotheses. But one important thing is when those hypotheses are sent, we account for the sensory displacement between the sensor modules when kind of transforming them to be usable by the other learning module. This is important because we don't want to just vote on, say, object ID, just that, okay, I think I'm on a mug. Are you on a mug as well? What that would result in is kind of a bag of features type form of recognition, where as long as they are kind of sensing locally something that could be a mug, they will all agree it's a mug, even if it was totally scrambled. And that's exactly the kind of more sort of texture bias, lack of shape robustness that humans don't have and that we don't want Monty to have. And so that's why there's this kind of use of the sensor displacement when carrying out voting. Kind of practically, what this means is that you can have kind of multiple sensory patches. So for example, here you have different sensory patches arranged in an approximate grid. And those are each seeing a different part of an object at a given point in time. They are each connected to a learning module. And then those learning modules are able to communicate with one another via voting. And by each seeing part of the object and also sharing their votes, we can dramatically speed up inference. And so this animation is just showing how at any given point in time, a particular learning module can be seeing something different. No learning module is seeing this. This is a kind of viewfinder view that's just for the kind of benefit of us as the experimenter. And when we're doing voting, we can parameterize how many of these patches we have. So you can imagine, at least in this kind of vision-like case, this is sort of the size of the grid. So the number of sensory modules and associated learning modules, the number of pairs of these. And here there's 5. In this example, there are 8. The other thing we can parameterize is how many of those learning modules must converge for the Monty system as a whole to converge. So we don't necessarily want to wait for all of the learning modules to say, I'm confident in what I'm seeing, because some of them may not be getting much input. And so in this paper, we just set this to 2. So we need 2 learning modules to converge for Monty as a whole to converge. We then look at what kind of agreement they have on the classification. And then the experiment we did was to vary the total number of these, essentially the size of this grid. And so that's what's shown here, where we see the number of steps until convergence as a function of the number of learning modules. And exactly as we would have hoped, we see kind of a very rapid reduction in how many steps are required for the system to converge as we add in more learning modules. Almost immediately eliminating many of these timeout episodes associated with 500 steps, and getting down to close to, we actually have a minimum number of steps that are required before an episode can converge, and it essentially kind of reaches that point. At the same time, we don't want this rapid inference to be at the cost of accuracy. And so this plot on the right is basically reassurance that we can achieve this without having this kind of reduction in robustness. If, as I mentioned earlier, we use kind of a more naive algorithm like that bag of features, we would almost certainly see a decrease in accuracy as we started adding in these kinds of non-meaningful hypotheses being shared. To then kind of wrap up the kind of discussion of voting, I think it's worth kind of pointing out that this is a great thing for Monty to have, to be able to benefit from a multitude of sensory inputs coming in at once. But it's important to emphasize that while Monty benefits from it, it is not reliant on it. So in the same way that you can feel a coffee mug with one finger or look at the world through a straw and still recognize and understand what you're seeing, Monty can operate in this kind of single learning module regime without issue. It's just that it benefits from having these multiple inputs. And this is a really important kind of, not really assumption, but more kind of like defining characteristic of Monty that we want to maintain, because no matter how artificial the setup may be, if you are in the real world, your sensors are inherently going to be limited in terms of sampling information. You're never going to be able to sample everything at once. So the sooner you kind of get out of that frame of mind and accept that information needs to be integrated over time, the more, I believe you kind of converge to architectures like Monty, where movement is the kind of central motif of the system. All right, so we talked first about robust inference and then about rapid inference. Now, the kind of final main section of the paper was then looking at rapid, continual, and efficient learning. Yeah, a bit of a mouthful, but I will break that down. It's worth noting that in this part of the paper, we do compare to VIT, so vision transformer networks, form of deep learning architectures, to kind of really ground the results. We're not trying to kind of imply that deep learning doesn't have useful applications. We use deep learning systems ourselves all the time. But the point really with these results is that Monty is a fundamentally different approach with some really unique advantages, which is what we're kind of excited to talk about today. For the kind of first thing we looked at was how rapidly Monty could learn, what's kind of sometimes referred to as sort of few-shot learning. In particular, kind of how quickly can it develop good representations given only a few observations of a particular object. So in order to kind of evaluate this, we take all the objects in the YCB dataset and we present each one at a fixed number of rotations. So for example, when the system, either VIT or Monty, is given one object view, across all YCB objects, it will just get a single view. If it's given 2 views, across all YCB objects, it will get 2 views. and then so forth to 16 views up until 32. And after each of these conditions, we look at, given that amount of training data, how well does the system perform, both in terms of classification accuracy and rotation error. And what we find is Monty learns extremely rapidly, getting kind of, so Monty's here in blue, 50% classification accuracy after only a single observation, very quickly kind of reaches close to its kind of optimal performance. The systems we compare to are VITs under a variety of conditions. So the strongest performing VIT is this pre-trained one, which only needs 25 epochs of training to perform at its best. But this model has been pre-trained rather, on 14 million images scraped from the internet and with labels. So classification of household objects is definitely not out of distribution for this network. And so it's, telling, I guess, that Monty, which knows nothing about these objects, can achieve essentially comparable performance. And in a moment, we'll see, firstly, how they differ on the rotation error, but also how Monty does in terms of computational efficiency. If the VIT is trained from scratch for 75 epochs, so it's seen, although it's only getting a certain number of rotations, it's revisiting those rotations many, many times. We get better performance, but still, significantly below Monty, which importantly only sees each object once. And so, in the same way that humans can learn extremely rapidly, we don't need to, pick up a new object and look at it close to 100 times before we can recognize it. Monty really just needs to see something once. And so, as a comparison, we include a VIT with 1 epoch of training. And this is the only VIT that gets the exact same amount of data exposure as Monty. And as you can see, it performs approximately around chance. It's just not nearly enough data for a deep learning system to learn. A starker difference appears when we look at the rotation error, which isn't too surprising because in this case, even for the pre-trained VIT, it's never had an objective to explicitly predict rotation error. And so for the kind of network to develop this ability, it's just not feasible with this amount of training data. But again, Monty kind of shows this really rapid learning as it sees more rotations. It's worth kind of understanding a bit more where this generalization comes from. And one of the kind of key aspects is what I was talking about before, that Monty naturally infers the potential rotation of the object based on what it's sensing. So if it senses this kind of corner here, for example, at the start of an episode, that could be consistent with the spam can in this orientation or in this orientation, because there's this kind of similar edge here. Those kind of hypotheses will both exist, and then Monty will kind of move over the object. But importantly, this hypothesis of the kind of can being inverted is not dependent on having ever seen the can inverted. In the same way that you could recognize an object upside down that you have never seen upside down by kind of just inferring that it's in that orientation, Monty is able to do the same. And so after seeing only a single rotation, only a single view of each object in the data set, Monty already gets 50% classification on a data set with 77 objects. And these are shown at novel rotations. The kind of other element to this is that, of course, many objects have kind of natural symmetry. That is, even if we present different views, some of their kind of aspects will be similar to the view that Monty or the VIT saw in the first one. But it's really important to emphasize that without this handling of rotation, generally a system cannot just rely on this sort of natural symmetry of faces to do well. And so that's why we don't see similar performance in the VIT trained from scratch. It's also maybe helpful to kind of understand how is Monty able to learn so quickly. And so I think a useful intuition for this is to think about, to kind of conceptualize the reference frames as maps. And in the same way that if you were kind of traveling around a city, like let's say you were a tourist visiting Rome, and you went to, say, Peter's Basilica, you kind of visited there, and then you travel, you see kind of a bridge as you go kind of east of the city, and then eventually reach kind of another landmark. As you're kind of going through and seeing these different parts of the city, you will just kind of associate what you have seen with that location. This is something you'll just do totally naturally and extremely quickly. With kind of spatial navigation, a lot of this relies on kind of a slightly older structure in mammals, the hippocampal complex, but the kind of principles are the same, that you are kind of performing movement and then essentially binding information to a location in a map. In this case, the map is the reference frame that the learning module, or in humans, a cortical column, is using. And so it's very kind of unambiguous where the system has to update its representation when kind of learning something new because of this use of a map. And this is going to lead to other benefits, which I'll touch on in a moment, in terms of continual learning and computational efficiency. So kind of long-standing problem in machine learning, deep learning in particular, is this issue of catastrophic forgetting, where if you train a system on kind of one task, and then you use, for example, a deep learning network with backpropagation of error, and then you then kind of get it to learn a different task, it will perform all of these global updates to its weights, essentially entirely forget about the task it knew before. And this is the kind of catastrophic forgetting phenomenon. Continual learning then is the kind of inverse of this. If you are resistant to catastrophic forgetting, you are able to learn continually. And this is something that we found in Monty when we looked, and it was actually something that we kind of expected to be there simply from how the kind of system works. So to kind of more concretely show kind of what the task setup we have is, so I'll start by describing it. So in order to assess continual learning, we have the 77 objects, and we break this up into kind of 77 tasks. And so any given task, Monty will learn one object, or the VIT will learn one object, given all of its kind of canonical rotations, those 14 rotations I discussed before. And then we're going to evaluate on all the objects that have been seen until then. So in order for the system to do well, it has to both learn about the object it's just seen, as well as retain a memory and information about the objects it saw before. We then learn on the next object and then repeat. And so to show this kind of more concretely, you can imagine, so if the first object is the Lego dataset, we're going to learn it on 14 rotations. The rotations aren't shown here. And then we're going to infer with some novel rotations and see how the system performs. Again, either the VIT or Monty. For the second task, we're going to learn on the fork, but this time we're going to infer and assess kind of performance on both the Lego object and the fork, because both of those have been observed. The third task, it learns the banana, but it has to then perform recognition on all three of these objects. So with that kind of lined out, then you see here the actual performance that we observed. So on the y-axis, we have the accuracy on all observed objects. So how the system kind of performs is dependent on how many objects it's seen. And then on the x-axis, we have the number of objects that have actually been learned. And what we see with Monty is what we would expect, where it does really well at the start because it only knows about a few objects. And so it quickly kind of decides that that's the object that it's observing. And then over the course of the kind of tasks, it gets a little bit of interference because naturally it will learn about a new object, say the peach, that is similar to an object it already knows about, the apple. And so that's inherently going to make future inference more difficult. But it is not catastrophic, which is what we see with the pre-trained VIT. So we used the pre-trained one since it was the most, the kind of strongest performing network in the previous rapid learning task. And for the very first task, it only has one object it can possibly classify as, so it achieves 100%. But then almost immediately, it begins consistently overriding its weights to predict the new object that it is kind of seeing, and then obliterates information it has in its weights about recognizing other objects. And this is shown in a kind of alternative view where we have kind of the number of objects that have been learned and then the target object. And so along the kind of diagonal is the performance on the current task. And so in general, you would expect if the system can learn the current task, the diagonal should be green. And that's what we see for both models. But if we look below the diagonal, this is the performance of the system on all the objects that it's seen before. And so what this kind of shows is that basically Monty is able to retain kind of a memory of many of these objects. It seems like there's maybe certain objects that are just difficult for Monty to learn for various reasons, perhaps ambiguous shape and so forth. Whereas the VIT, again, is catastrophically overriding its weights and shows almost no evidence of being able to kind of recall these previous objects it's learned. And I think it's worth just kind of emphasizing the importance of continual learning, as a task structure. It's, especially even this extreme case we consider here, where each task consists of only a single object. So deep learning systems are inherently dependent on very kind of contrastive learning in order to develop representations. In order to distinguish kind of two objects, it needs to see one and then the other, and essentially learn to kind of separate those representations and do this constantly in kind of a shuffled order. But of course, when you're moving through the world, the statistics are constantly changing, firstly, and so constantly leading to the problem of catastrophic forgetting. But the kind of inputs you see are also highly temporally correlated. So, if you were learning about an edible fruit and you were a hunter-gatherer or another animal, you would, naturally find these kinds of things clustered together. You're not going to get kind of a lineup of all possible fruit that you might want to eat and all fruit that might be poisonous, and then be able to kind of hold those side by side and compare them. And so being able to learn kind of in isolation, just given what's in front of you, through movement and what we kind of explore with Monty is really crucial. To kind of then understand how Monty is, why is Monty robust to continual learning? I think it's again useful to consider this map analogy. So let's say again you are in Rome, you're going around, you're seeing some new things. If you then kind of see something new and you are kind of making a note to remember that, you're in Rome, so you're only going to update your kind of internal representation of your kind of Rome map. You're not going to make changes to all these other maps you have for other cities that may be kind of partially or very familiar to you. This kind of targeted, what could be called local or sparse updating to the model is exactly what Monty is doing when it kind of sees something new. And this means that we don't get this kind of issue of catastrophic forgetting. As we'll see in a moment, we also get some benefits in terms of computational efficiency. And in particular, we see some really dramatic improvements in kind of the computational efficiency of Monty when it comes to learning when compared to these VIT models, and actually some decent performance as well in the kind of domain of inference. And in order to look at the kind of computational efficiency, we quantify this with floating point operations. So you can think of this as any kind of, as the name implies, floating point operation happening in the computer. And so a variety of algorithms, whether it is a VIT, a deep learning system, or it's how we've implemented Monty, these algorithms need to execute these operations on a computer in order to kind of carry out a task. And so we're basically just counting how many of these flops in total are being done. We're not concerned with how many happen per second. Just to clarify, sometimes flops with an S refers to per second. Here, we're just counting the total number of floating point operations. And at learning, we see a huge difference between Monty and these other systems. So we have training flops along the x-axis here, and this is a logarithmic scale going up to 10 to the power of 20, where Monty is all the way down here at 10 to the power of 11. And this is all the learning that Monty does. The VIT here, which if you recall from earlier, did significantly worse both in terms of accuracy classification and also rotation error. still uses a huge amount, 4 orders of magnitude more flops in order to perform learning. The pre-trained VIT, which was the only one that could do kind of comparably on the classification task, uses both far more flops in the kind of fine-tuning stage, but particularly kind of staggering is the amount of compute needed for the pre-training stage. So this is kind of where, Monty really stands out in terms of computational efficiency. If kind of inference, we can do kind of a similar comparison. And what we show here is a variety of kind of different VIT models of different sizes. So generally, as you go along the right towards more flops, these are VIT models that have more parameters. And often more parameters in deep learning results in better performance. And these are either the kind of pre-trained variant if they have the filled-in circle, or from scratch. For Monty, then we look at a system that has a random walk. So this is the kind of distant agent that is kind of like a camera performing a random walk. In all our VIT comparisons up until now, and also here, this is the agent we use, even though this is definitely the worst performing Monty system. The reason we did that was to make the comparison fair, because the VIT sees the object from one side, and so Monty also sees it from one side. However, Monty is a sensory motor system. It's much more natural for it to engage its policies to act intelligently in the world. And that's what we see here with this system that has access to the hypothesis testing policy. And what's really nice is even the baseline does extremely well in terms of kind of the accuracy versus flops trade-off, particularly with the rotation error. But when we kind of add in this policy, rather than making the system more complex and resulting in more flops, it actually dramatically reduces the number of flops while also improving the accuracy and reducing the rotation error. So it's just kind of a nice demonstration of the real kind of benefits of bringing in these kinds of sensory motor concepts into kind of learning intelligence systems. To then kind of understand the flop efficiency, it's a very similar concept to before. At learning, again, if you are in Rome and you're kind of laying down a representation, you're only going to do that, laying down kind of a memory, you're only going to do that in your Rome map. That means you don't have to update all of the other, firstly, and I should say, where in Rome you are as well. So you don't have to make changes to all these other locations on your map, and you don't have to make locations to all the other maps for other cities. So it's a very local, again, very sparse change to the system. That means very few floating point operations. And during inference, what tends to happen is, even though Monty has like a relatively broad search space of hypotheses that it's considering, at the first sensation, it generally considers all 77 objects relatively possible, because if you just felt the surface of something, you wouldn't really have a good idea of what it is you're touching. And also, many rotations are going to be possible. So it tends to begin with a large search space, which does involve a lot of floating point operations. But as it senses more of the object and becomes more confident, it can quickly rule out a lot of hypotheses. And that's kind of visualized here, where this is now during inference, you're trying to figure out what city you're in. But because of the landmarks you've already seen and the movement you've done, you're pretty confident somewhere in Rome. You're just trying to figure out where, and you can eliminate all of these other hypotheses as ones that need testing. And so that significantly reduces the amount of flops that accrue. I think to kind of conclude this section on the sort of rapid, continual, and efficient learning, I think it's really important to emphasize that these are all kind of natural consequences that emerged when we were working with sensory motor learning with reference frames. So it wasn't the case that we kind of carried out some laborious or targeted optimization to kind of extract or kind of bake in these sort of properties. It just naturally emerges from the way kind of learning happens. And I think this is one of the reasons we're so excited about the direction the Thousand Brains project is taking and the progress it's making, because all of this was originally informed by hypotheses about how the brain works, how the cortex works based on no neuroanatomy, no neurophysiology. We then kind of implemented the system, as said, to kind of be able to achieve some basic properties like recognizing objects. And very naturally kind of properties that have been very difficult to achieve in machine learning, from shape bias to symmetry detection to continual learning to efficient learning, are all kind of naturally popping out. So we think that's a good indication that we're approximately on the right track. I think it's also worth kind of emphasizing that lifelong learning is a huge thing that we want to be able to develop to have intelligent systems, and often this focuses on the problem of continual learning because that is such a kind of major hurdle that hasn't been overcome. But I think it's important to emphasize that continual learning and avoiding catastrophic forgetting is just one element of that. Being able to learn rapidly, so very quickly, and also being able to learn efficiently, so not needing to use entire GPU clusters every time you want to train your model, is extremely important to unlocking that capability. And so it's exciting that Monty seems to show evidence of kind of all three of those already. The images here where you get to show some lifelong learners, some adults, and then this is just an example of a totally novel object you've never seen before, but probably after a few glances you already had a kind of reasonable representation of what it was. You didn't need to compare it to some other object that you may have seen before, or sleep in order to initiate kind of recall type contrastive learning, or do any of these things. You were able to just learn it, almost instantaneously. So that kind of concludes the results that we kind of discussed in the paper. I just thought I'd very briefly kind of discuss what we talk about conclusion, which is the future research we're working on at the moment. One of the key things we're really excited about is compositional objects. And so this is something which the paper Vivian is going to separately be talking about in a bit. Our hierarchy paper, which looks at neuroanatomy, has a lot of interesting ideas for how the brain might be doing this. And so in the same way that Monty is kind of a manifestation of the 1,000 brains theory from a couple of years ago, now we're kind of taking some of these kind of newer neuroscience theory ideas and bringing them into kind of the latest version of Monty. And so this is where we're going to be able to kind of develop more complex, more interesting hierarchical representations of objects, like a mug with a logo on it. And then the other kind of thing we're working on, the other main kind of research we're doing is on object behaviors. This is more kind of in the theoretical stage, where we're still figuring out exactly how we believe the brain figures out and kind of represents objects that move and objects that can be interacted with and so forth. But we think we've made some interesting progress, and look forward to kind of sharing more with everyone soon. And then the last thing to mention is all of this has been very kind of fundamental research, but of course our long-term hope is it's going to have a variety of beneficial applications downstream in the real world, everything from agricultural robotics to the kind of energy sector, and kind of ensuring that equipment is kind of kept well maintained, to things like medical ultrasound. These are in general instances where you may not have much data, where again the distribution of the real world can constantly change. You cannot rely on kind of features that may kind of change as a result of lighting and wind, rain, weather, so forth. You really need to rely on things like shape. All these things that kind of Monty was showing in his paper should really be useful in kind of these downstream applications. So that's something we're looking forward to. Thanks very much for listening.